Just what is evolution? What's Darwinism? Is Darwinism science, or is it philosophy? For that matter, is Darwinism even evolutionism? You'd think we'd have these questions pretty well nailed down by now. Yet there's actually a great deal of confusion surrounding these questions, and this makes Darwinism and evolutionism very slippery concepts. The slipperiness is one of the reasons the Darwinian idea has become so entrenched in our science and our culture. It's hard to pin down a greased pig. Let's start with the conventional trope of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Nothing in that phrase parses true. Darwin's theory is not so much a theory as it is a story to explain the history of life on Earth. By some accounts, Darwin's theory is not one story, but multiple stories. That Darwinism is generally regarded as a persuasive story does not make it true, nor does it make it a theory. It's more a cosmogony, really, than a theory. It's an origins story, in other words. All that's needed to make a cosmogony a persuasive story is to make it internally coherent. It has to make sense from within the story. The cosmogony of the southern African Khoisan people is, no doubt, as coherent an explanation of the universe to its adherents as the Darwinian cosmogony is for the Western mind. Coherency itself doesn't make a cosmogony true, however. So we ask the Darwinist, what makes the Darwinian cosmogony more believable than the Khoisan variety? Why should it have a special claim on truth? Or for that matter, any of the several Darwinian cosmogonies. For example, the meaning which Darwin himself attached to the words natural selection bears little resemblance to what those words presently mean to us. In fact, our current theory of natural selection is, if anything, anti-Darwinian in conception and form, at least in the terms Darwin himself conceived natural selection to be. So, which Darwinian cosmogony should be the object of our fealty? So, there's a lot of confusion that needs clearing up. At its root, evolutionism is a specific statement about the history of life on Earth, namely that it has changed over time. In other words, creatures that inhabited the Earth in the past are different from those of today. This differs from the doctrine that life on Earth presently is pretty much the same as it has always been since its creation. You can think dinosaurs, which roamed the Earth up to about 65 million years ago, but are nowhere to be found today. And you can think humans, which presently dominate the living world, but were nowhere to be found when dinosaurs roamed the Earth. You get the point. Dinosaurs versus humans is a comparatively recent contrast, just 65 to 100 million years separating them. Life's history stretches back much farther, to its origin about 3.5 billion years ago. That's the origin of cellular life, by the way. Traces of life can be seen much closer to the earliest time that the Earth had cooled sufficiently to retain oceans of water, perhaps closer to 4 billion years. For most of that early history, bacteria dominated the living Earth. Collectively, bacteria are called prokaryotes. The word means before the seed and refers to the absence of a nucleus in these cells. About 1 billion years ago, a new form of cell appeared with nuclei, which are not found among bacteria. These were called eukaryotes. Eukaryote means true seed. The eukaryotes lived as single-celled creatures up to about 750 million years ago. At that time, they began to form coalitions, groups of diverse types of eukaryotic cells living together in tight associations. These coalitions were the foundations of the eukaryotic kingdoms, the fungi, the plants, and our own kingdom, the animals. In turn, each of those kingdoms has its own history. Among the animals, for example, there were only aquatic animals to begin with, which began to venture onto land about 180 million years ago. From there emerged the fully terrestrial animals, the reptiles, the mammals like ourselves, and birds. I could go on and on, but you get the idea. Life on Earth has evolved. It has a history, and evolutionism is the recognition of that history. The science of evolution has two dimensions. The first is documenting the actual history. When did amphibians arise? When did dinosaurs go extinct? How did the mammals arise from their reptilian ancestors? Those sorts of questions. The second dimension is understanding what shaped that history. Natural selection was Darwin's hypothesis for this, but Darwin's was not the only hypothesis, neither in his own time nor now. The Darwinian idea presents itself as the only legitimate scientific solution to the problem of evolution and to the origin of species. What is often not appreciated is how the Darwinian idea fits into the broader philosophical framework of Western civilization. Any claim to scientific authority has to be evaluated in that broader philosophical context. I put together a handy little flow diagram that lays this out. Let's start with a rough timeline of Western civilization from its origin a few centuries before Christ and up to the 21st century. Let's put in a few labels. The classical period spans the 4th century BC up to the fall of Rome, and this was followed by the medieval period, which takes us up to the 16th century. Classical philosophy was dominated by three broad schools of thought, which also dominates our present, by the way. One we can describe as atomism. This was the notion that the universe is composed of innumerable indivisible atoms. Atomism holds that the orderliness and organization of the world arises from the bottom up, from the interaction of those atoms. No divinity or overarching organizing force need be involved. And this is why atomism is properly regarded as a purposeless philosophy. At the same time, atomism was countered by what we can call the two purposeful philosophies. Plato stands out as the first, while his student Aristotle stands out as the second and alternative philosopher. Both their philosophies regarded the universe as imbued with purposefulness, and this set both apart from the atomists. Plato and Aristotle differed primarily on where the purposefulness comes from. Plato's purposefulness was centered on his concept of ideals, and these arose from a prime mover of some sort, a demiurge. The purposefulness of the world was a reflection of the mind of the demiurge. The Christian God, as creator of the universe, is essentially the Platonic God. Aristotle was more empirical and down to earth in his approach. While Aristotle also believed there was a prime mover of sorts, a demiurge, he also saw purposefulness arising as something inherent in nature, in particular for living things. Living things were not just mindless puppets acting at the behest of the demiurge, they had lives and minds of their own, if you will. As Aristotle himself put it, living things were imbued with anima, an animating principle that distinguished them from the inanimate world. Another word for anima, by the way, is soul, and this was a point of substantial difference between Plato and Aristotle. Where Plato saw the soul as the transient occupant of the body of a living thing, leaving the body upon death, Aristotle saw the soul as something inherent to life itself. Okay, back to our history. We can map out the course of these three philosophies along the timeline as if they were rivers flowing through time. The wider the river, the greater the influence. We're drawing them starting out as roughly equally influential. But during the classical period and on into the medieval period, the atomistic idea failed to carry much water, indicated by the narrowness of the stream as we've drawn it. The purposeful philosophies of Aristotle and Plato, in contrast, dominated classical and medieval thought. Up through the 18th century, the two in fact overlapped considerably, and out of this arose what we can call classical natural history. Natural history was the beginnings of a scientific approach to nature. It emphasized looking to nature itself rather than scriptural or mythological authority to explain its own existence. Out of this approach, by the way, arose a new form of Christian apologetics known as natural theology. The linchpin of natural theology was the famous argument from design, that the intricate workings and wonder of living nature were objective evidence of the existence of the omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent Creator. To put it another way, if the world was self-evidently wondrously designed, that could only have come from a wondrous designer. QED. Natural theology dominated natural history well into the 18th and 19th centuries. Darwin himself was strongly influenced by it. At the same time, during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, atomism was enjoying a rebirth, with discoveries in chemistry and physics that led to modern theories of the atom, work, and force. Robert Boyle, James Priestley, and Isaac Newton are the familiar figures in this development. In the life sciences, this resurgent atomist tradition became the foundation for the reductionist sciences of life, such as biochemistry and molecular biology. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. Those were 20th century developments. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the two purpose philosophies that had been united under the sway of classical natural history and natural theology began to depart from one another. One branch, which we might call Neoplatonism, gave rise to the modern sciences of taxonomy, systematics, and embryology. These philosophies tended to look to Platonic idealism, and in some instances, the Platonic demiurge as the motivating force in nature. Living species, for example, were considered to be reflections of an ideal conception of a species. Species of starfish were variations on the ideal of starfishness, if you will. I wrote about this in The Tinkerer's Accomplice. Understanding this allows us to treat intelligent design theory as a kind of resurgent Platonism. In contrast, the Aristotelian tradition gave rise to the beginnings of evolutionary thought, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and ultimately Darwin himself. Darwin's focus on the origin of species, the name of his book, remember, reflects the growing troubles of the Platonic concept of the species. But also, coming out of this neo-Aristotelian tradition were the modern sciences of physiology, my own science, as well as the science of ontogeny, the origins of form. Again, looking to life itself on its own to tell us how it worked and how it came to be. Darwin himself presents a complicated chapter in this story. Even though he grew up in the classical traditions of natural theology and natural history, he had an ambition to take natural history into the realm of mechanism. That is to say, he wanted to meld evolutionism with the atomistic philosophical tradition. He wanted a mechanism that did not involve messy holdovers from natural theology, in other words. This venture is what we may call classical Darwinism. Darwin's ambition, it has to be said, didn't really work out very well. The Darwinian idea came under increasing scientific criticism, producing the late 19th century crisis of Darwinism. I just want to note, as an aside for now, that the principal criticisms of Darwin's ideas at this time came mostly from his fellow scientists. Darwin had his religious critics, to be sure, but the religious criticisms of Darwinism were mostly internecine conflicts within the churches, quite divorced from Darwinism's scientific merits. Yet Darwin's ambition of an atomistic science of evolution was rescued in the 1920s with the neo-Darwinist theory of evolution. Neo-Darwinism was rooted in atomist philosophy. It used the statistical mechanics of gases as its inspiration for the behavior of genes. And this transformed evolutionism profoundly, to the point that neo-Darwinism bears little resemblance to the classical Darwinism of Darwin himself. Among the deeper consequences of this revolution was to alienate the phenomenon of evolution from the phenomenon of life, to turn life into a kind of clockwork, a machine. All sorts of inconsistencies sit embedded in this transformation. Those inconsistencies have grown to the point that the neo-Darwinist philosophy is approaching its own crisis point. My hope is that physiology, that is to say, the neo-Aristotelian philosophy that gave rise to my own field, can produce a more and new coherent theory of evolution. As an aside, my little map helps clarify the landscape of the public perception of evolution. It's not a war of science versus religion, as it's often portrayed. It's a conflict between two irreconcilable philosophies. One is the essentially Platonic intelligent design theory, and the other is the presumptively atomistic neo-Darwinism. These are so far apart philosophically that no reconciliation between them is possible, and the public is the ultimate loser in this standoff. What I'm saying is that there's a third way between the two, one where we can escape the philosophical dogmatism that now prevails. And this third way brings us back to a more coherent Aristotelian view of life and its evolution, one that reoccupies what is presently a no man's land that sits squarely in the middle of our public square. Phew, that was a lot. But we had to go through it because it offers a different take on what we mean by scientific. We can now see clearly that Darwinism's claim to be a scientific theory rests upon a philosophical assertion that science is the same thing as an atomist philosophy. By that logic, any claim about evolution that comes from another philosophical tradition is, ipso facto, not science. For the sciences of life, including the evolution of life, that logic generally doesn't stand up very well. So, for example, molecular biology can make a legitimate claim to being an atomistic science. It's been a stunningly successful approach to studying life, in fact. We understand the material nature of the gene, for example, because we have a pretty good idea of the chemistry of nucleic acids, and that's a pretty big deal. But does understanding of the chemistry of DNA give us a complete understanding of life itself? Most molecular biologists would actually say no, and I, coming from my own philosophical tradition, would agree. Among other things, I say no because to say yes relegates a vast part of the life sciences to the non-scientific realm. This is what neo-Darwinism claims when it purports to be the only scientific solution to the problem of evolution. What's needed, I think, is a broader definition of what science is. And here's my definition. Science is the practice of asking nature to tell us about itself without intervening filters of religious or philosophical certitude. This was the problem with natural theology. There was a pretty strong filter for interpreting what nature was telling us, and it's the same problem with neo-Darwinism. So, for example, the atomistic tradition relies heavily on the experimental method. You generate a hypothesis, devise an experimental test for it, and then do the experiment. But what about evolution? What experiment can you do there? Evolutionism has always relied on a different method of inference through description. It's a historical science, remember? And ever since Georges Cuvier described the sequence of fossil lives written in the sedimentary rocks of the Paris Basin in the early 19th century, we have known that life has a history. Nature itself has written the record of that history, which we can read if we know how. But there's no experiment to be done. Rather, we learn more by fitting together different pieces of a puzzle. Putting a timeline to Cuvier's history, for example, depended upon having an accurate way to tell how old rocks were. That didn't come around until the mid-20th century with the development of radioisotope dating. Again, there's no experiment involved. It's rather a matter of filling in small pieces of a puzzle that ultimately reveals a convincing answer. It's still science, though, even if it does follow a different path. In this case, the convincing scientific answer is that life does indeed have a history, It has evolved. It has not always been as it is presently. Physiologists like me come from an entirely different philosophical tradition, one that actually is rooted in the purposeful philosophies of neo-Aristotelianism, and I will hotly defend the status of physiology as a science. We do use experiments, but we also look to life as a unique phenomenon that demands its own methods of inquiry. I would even argue that intelligent design theory qualifies as a science. I remain unconvinced that its inherent Platonism will clarify things much, but it still is trying to fill in a puzzle in its own way, and it's an idea we should engage, not shun. My argument is that physiology, coming as it does from its unique philosophical tradition, can restore the essential qualities of life itself to our understanding of evolution, to make evolution a life science again, in short. It might even enrich our public understanding of evolution. Okay, let's get started on that project.